Welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into the most thrilling, heart-stopping, and emotionally complex moments of the bold and the beautiful. Today is a spectacular day to unpack the explosive drama currently unfolding in Los Angeles, as the stakes have never been higher for our favorite characters. Let us journey together into the shadows of the Spencer legacy. The rain did not merely fall. It assaulted the glass of Bill Spencer's luxurious beach house with a violent, rhythmic fury, as if the heavens themselves were attempting to shatter the fragile sanctuary within. The Pacific Ocean, usually a picturesque backdrop of Californian serenity, had transformed into a roaring abyss of black water and white foam, echoing the profound, churning turmoil that was about to consume the lives of those trapped inside the estate. The beach house, normally a place of refuge and romantic escapism, was entirely engulfed in the suffocating darkness of the storm, isolated from the rest of Los Angeles by flooded coastal roads and a relentless downpour. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken dread, a heavy, suffocating tension that clung to the walls and settled into the very bones of its occupants. While Spencer, seeking a moment of clarity amidst the chaotic wreckage of his romantic life, paced the hardwood floors, completely unaware that this tempestuous night would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his existence and plunge him into a deadly game of survival. Will had retreated to the beach house to escape the suffocating pressure of Forrester Creations and the maddening, manipulative narrative that R.J. Forrester had spun around Elektra. His heart was a bruised and battered organ, torn between his enduring, genuine love for Elektra and the frustrating reality of her indecision. In an act of profound compassion, he had allowed Melissa Dillon to stay at the beach house, offering her a safe haven from the mysterious stalker that had been terrorizing her. Will saw Dillon as a victim, a vulnerable woman caught in a terrifying web of harassment, and his innate Spencer protective instinct had compelled him to offer her shelter. However, as the lightning flashed, illuminating the grand, empty living room in stark, ghostly bursts of white light, Will was about to discover that the woman he was protecting harbored secrets darker and more dangerous than he could have ever possibly imagined. The discovery was entirely accidental, a cruel twist of fate orchestrated by the storm. Will had walked into the guest bedroom to check if the windows were securely fastened against the gale-force winds. The room was empty, Dillon having presumably gone to the kitchen, but left behind on the edge of the mahogany writing desk was a crumpled, tear-stained piece of heavy parchment. It was the physical manifestation of a broken soul, the paper warped by the moisture of fresh tears and the ink slightly smeared. Drawn by a sense of foreboding that tightened his chest, Will reached for the paper, his fingers brushing against the fragile surface. He did not intend to pry into Dillon's private thoughts, but the first few words, written in a frantic, trembling script, caught his eye and paralyzed him with a sudden, icy terror. It was a draft of a suicide note, a desperate, agonizing final confession from a woman who believed that death was her only remaining escape route. As Will read the words, his blood ran cold, and the ambient noise of the crashing storm outside faded into a distant, muted hum. The letter was a harrowing descent into Dillon's fractured psyche, detailing her overwhelming exhaustion, her paralyzing fear, and her profound, crushing guilt. She wrote of a darkness that had consumed her, a relentless shadow named Remy Price that had stalked her every waking moment and infiltrated her nightmares. But it was the second paragraph that struck Will with the force of a physical blow, completely shattering his perception of the woman he had sworn to protect. In stark, unforgiving terms, Dillon confessed to the devastating truth behind her past. She was not merely a victim of Remy's obsession, but his active accomplice in a massive, highly orchestrated art fraud syndicate. The letter detailed how Remy had manipulated the system to secure her the prestigious art teacher job, using forged credentials, stolen provenances, and counterfeit appraisals that Dillon herself had helped fabricate. The revelation was a seismic shock to Will's moral foundation. The art fraud was not a minor indiscretion. It was a federal crime, a sophisticated web of deception that had defrauded galleries and collectors out of millions. Dylan, the woman he had viewed with such profound pity and protective tenderness, was a criminal. She had compromised her integrity, broken the law, and allowed herself to be tethered to a dangerous sociopath in exchange for a semblance of stability and a career. The note explained her current, agonizing predicament. Remy had returned not out of unrequited love, but to collect his dues, blackmailing her with the evidence of their shared crimes to force her into executing his new, sinister demands. Terrified of losing her job, facing federal prison, and returning to the brutal reality of homelessness, Dylan had concluded that taking her own life was the only way to silence Remy and protect those she cared about from the fallout of her sins. Will stood frozen, the paper trembling in his hands as a violent storm of conflicting emotions raged within him. The Spencer legacy, defined by his father Bill's ruthless, uncompromising nature, whispered in his ear, urging him to cast her out, to protect the family name from the taint of a criminal scandal. If the authorities discovered that a Spencer was harboring a fugitive involved in grand larceny and art fraud, the media fallout would be catastrophic. Yet, Will's inherent goodness, the moral compass that so often set him apart from the darker elements of his lineage, pulled him in the opposite direction. He was faced with an excruciating, impossible choice. Does he immediately call the police, turning in the woman whose tear-stained suicide note he held in his hands, effectively condemning her to the very destruction she was trying to escape? Or does he become an accessory after the fact, burying the truth, covering up a federal crime, and protecting a woman who had lied to him from the moment she crossed his threshold? Before Will could process the monumental weight of this dilemma, the door to the guest bedroom slowly creaked open. Melissa Dillon stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the hallway. She looked like a ghost, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes wide and bloodshot from hours of silent, agonizing weeping. The moment her gaze fell upon the piece of paper in Will's hands, the remaining color drained entirely from her face. The silence that stretched between them was absolute, heavier and more oppressive than the raging tempest battering the beach house. Dylan did not attempt to snatch the letter away. She did not scream or deny the truth. Instead, her shoulders slumped in a gesture of total, catastrophic defeat. The secret she had carried, the heavy, suffocating burden that had driven her to the brink of self-destruction, was finally out in the open, exposed to the one person whose judgment she feared the most. When Dylan finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, a fragile, broken sound that cracked with the weight of her shame. She did not offer excuses, but rather a raw, unflinching explanation of her descent into darkness. She spoke of the paralyzing, soul-crushing terror of living in her car, the gnawing hunger, and the profound vulnerability of being a woman alone on the unforgiving streets of Los Angeles. Remy Price had not appeared to her as a monster, but as a savior, offering her a lifeline when she was drowning in poverty. The art fraud, she explained through choked sobs, was a desperate act of survival, a terrible compromise she made to secure a roof over her head and a chance at a normal life. She detailed how Remy's charm had slowly morphed into coercive control, how the trap had snapped shut around her before she even realized she was a prisoner. Dylan fell to her knees, weeping uncontrollably, begging Will not for forgiveness, but for the understanding that she was a woman who had made a horrific mistake out of pure, unadulterated desperation. Will stared down at the broken woman sobbing on his floor, his heart caught in a brutal tug-of-war between righteous anger and profound, aching empathy. He wanted to be furious with her for bringing this danger to his doorstep, for lying to his face, and for compromising his own integrity. Yet, looking at Dylan, he did not see a hardened criminal mastermind. He saw a profoundly traumatized survivor who had been manipulated, used, and discarded by a predator. The suicide note in his hand was proof that her conscience was torturing her, that the guilt of her actions was a punishment far more severe than any prison sentence. Will slowly knelt beside her, the anger draining from his body, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. He realized in that moment that he could not hand her over to the authorities. He could not be the final instrument of her destruction. He made the agonizing choice to carry her secret, to step into the darkness with her, and to help her find a way out of Remy's suffocating grip. However, the universe has a cruel way of punishing those who attempt to play savior in the shadows. Just as Will reached out to place a comforting hand on Dylan's trembling shoulder, the atmosphere in the beach house shifted with terrifying suddenness. The power, already flickering from the storm, completely died, plunging the estate into absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light came from the sporadic, violent flashes of lightning that ripped across the night sky. Over the deafening roar of the ocean and the pounding rain, a new sound emerged, a slow, deliberate, heavy footstep echoing from the grand staircase in the main living area. Someone else was inside the house. The realization hit like a bucket of ice water. The security system, disabled by the power outage, had failed them. They were completely isolated, cut off from the world, and trapped in the dark with an unknown entity. Dylan's reaction was immediate and visceral. A low, primal whimper escaped her lips, and she scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the wall as if trying to merge with the drywall. Her eyes, wide with absolute terror, darted toward the hallway. She knew, with the instinctive, terrifying certainty of a hunted prey, exactly who had breached their sanctuary. Will stood up slowly, his muscles tensing, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He positioned himself firmly between Dylan and the open doorway, his eyes straining to pierce the impenetrable gloom. Another flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, and in that split second of blinding white light, the nightmare became flesh and bone. Standing at the threshold of the room, dripping wet from the storm, with a sinister, unhinged smile playing on his lips, was Remy Price. Remy's physical presence was overwhelming, a terrifying blend of calculated menace and explosive, unpredictable violence. He did not look like a common burglar. He looked like a man who had come to claim what was rightfully his. The water dripped from his dark hair, pooling on the expensive hardwood floor, a stark contrast to the pristine luxury of the Spencer estate. In his right hand, loosely gripped but unmistakably deadly, was a heavy, metallic object, a firearm, its dark barrel absorbing the ambient shadows. Remy's eyes, cold and dead, locked onto Will, a chilling amusement dancing in his gaze. He had bypassed the gates, navigated the storm, and infiltrated the fortress, proving that there was nowhere Dylan could hide that he could not reach. The stalker had finally cornered his prey, and he had brought the threat of absolute, final violence into Will Spencer's home. A touching scene. Remy's voice sliced through the darkness, smooth, mocking, and laced with a lethal undertone. The billionaire prince playing knight in shining armor for the broken little art thief. It's almost poetic, really. Remy stepped fully into the room, the gun now casually raised, pointing directly at Will's chest. The air in the room grew instantly colder, the oxygen seemingly sucked out by the sheer gravity of the threat. Remy's instructions were clear, delivered with the terrifying calm of a man who held absolute power over life and death. If Will attempted to reach for his phone, if he made a sudden movement toward the panic button, or if he tried to play the hero, Remy promised to paint the walls of the beach house with their blood. It was not an idle threat. It was a solemn, psychotic vow. The life-or-death confrontation had begun, and the rules of engagement were dictated entirely by a madman. Remy began to pace slowly, a predator circling its trapped victims, using psychological warfare to dismantle any remaining resistance. He turned his attention to Will, his words dripping with venomous disdain. He mocked Will's privilege, his wealthy upbringing, and his naive belief that he could save a woman who was already fundamentally corrupted. Remy laid bare the gritty, ugly reality of their shared past, ensuring that Will understood the full extent of Dylan's complicity in the art fraud. He painted a picture of Dylan not as a victim, but as a willing participant who had enjoyed the fruits of their illegal labor until the guilt became too heavy to bear. Remy's goal was to shatter Will's protective instinct, to make him disgusted by the woman cowering behind him, and to isolate Dylan completely, stripping her of her only remaining ally. The psychological torture was almost as unbearable as the physical threat. Dylan, paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of her abuser, clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut as if trying to block out the reality of the moment. Remy's voice was the soundtrack of her deepest traumas, a relentless reminder of the chains that bound her to her darkest mistakes. He taunted her, reminding her of the forged signatures, the fake appraisals, the thrill of the deception, and the money they had stolen together. He told her that she belonged to him, that her soul was as black as his, and that no amount of Spencer money or Will's naive affection could ever wash away the stain of her crimes. Remy was systematically destroying her mind before he even had to pull the trigger, reinforcing the belief that she was entirely worthless, entirely guilty, and entirely his. But Remy had severely miscalculated the depth of Will Spencer's character. He had expected the billionaire heir to recoil in horror, to abandon the tainted woman to save his own skin. Instead, Will's resolve hardened into an unbreakable, diamond-like determination. The revelations of Dylan's past, rather than alienating him, fueled a profound, righteous fury directed entirely at Remy. Will saw through the manipulation, recognizing Remy not as a mastermind, but as a cowardly, parasitic abuser who preyed on the vulnerable. Will stood his ground, his posture rigid, his eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding defiance. He refused to break eye contact with the man holding the gun. Will realized that this was no longer about the morality of the art fraud. This was a primal, fundamental battle for survival. He was not going to let this monster execute a broken woman in his home. If Remy wanted to get to Dylan, he would have to go through Spencer to do it. The tension in the room reached a terrifying, boiling crescendo, the atmosphere so fraught with impending violence that it felt as though the very air might ignite. The storm outside seemed to mirror the explosive standoff within, the thunder crashing with deafening intensity as lightning continuously illuminated the deadly tableau. Will, unarmed but fueled by an adrenaline-laced surge of protective instinct, slowly shifted his weight, preparing for the inevitable physical confrontation. He calculated the distance between himself and Remy, analyzing the madman's grip on the weapon, searching for any microscopic opening, any momentary lapse in concentration. Dylan, sensing Will's preparation, opened her eyes, watching the man she had lied to prepare to sacrifice his life for hers. The tragic, terrifying beauty of the moment hung, suspended in the dark, a fragile breath between life and death. Remy, sensing the shift in Will's demeanor, tightened his grip on the firearm, his mocking smile fading into a grim, murderous scowl. He realized that psychological warfare had failed, that the Spencer boy was actually willing to die for the thief. The ultimate climax of the night was upon them, a violent collision of past sins and present desperation. In this isolated beach house, surrounded by the raging tempest, the darkest secrets had been dragged into the light, and the consequences were about to be paid in blood. Will braced himself, his muscles coiled like springs, ready to launch himself into the abyss to protect a woman whose crimes were eclipsed only by her suffering. As the thunder roared one final, deafening time, the standoff teetered on the razor's edge of catastrophe, leaving the fate of Will Spencer and Melissa Dillon hanging precariously in the terrifying